Hi, my name's Sally and I'm a bereavement counsellor at Springhill Hospice. I'm going to talk to you about the growing around grief model that was developed by Dr. Lois Tonkin. Lois Tonkin was a grief counsellor and a researcher in New Zealand. She developed her model of helping people to cope with grief almost by accident. She found that some of her clients didn't really fit into the models of grief that she was using at the time. And some of them were talking about the pain of their grief and how even though they were living their life, the pain was still as big and still as overwhelming as ever. So Lois Tonkin was lucky enough to hear a woman describing her grief in a workshop run by another counsellor and researcher called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. This woman's ideas made sense of grief in a way that the models Lois Tonkin had been using earlier didn't. The woman was her inspiration, if you like, for the model of grief we now refer to as growing around grief, or the fried egg model of grief. It grew from the concept that we don't get over our grief, we learn to live with it. Grief can be all-consuming, powerful and overwhelming. And as we move through time and begin to live our lives, triggers, which are the things that set our grief off again, such as a piece of music or a TV programme or an anniversary, can catapult us back into this all-consuming grief. So let's have a look at the fried egg model in more detail. Some people call it that because it looks like a fried egg when you draw it. And if we explore it, it will help us to see how Lois Tonkin's model of growing around grief works. So let's have a look at the first circle on the left. This represents two different parts of a bereaved person's grief. Initially, grief might consume you totally, filling every part of your life, both awake and when you're asleep. And the circle around the outside represents a person's life, and the shading represents their grief. The circle and the shading can be represented by any colour, and there could be different shapes for different people. So as you can see in figure 2, there's an example that I've drawn of how grief can look completely different for some people. And it can feel tangled and messy, as well as being all-consuming and overwhelming. And your grief might look a different shape and a different colour and even a different size for you. Immediately after you've lost your loved one, you might feel totally consumed by your grief and unable to think about anything else. And people sometimes imagine that as time goes by, their grief might shrink or become smaller and more manageable. And they think that this will happen whilst it probably will never fully go away. But for some people, this is what happens, but not for everybody. So if we have a look at the second circle, this circle shows that for some people, grief stays just as big and powerful, but you grow and expand around it, and you begin to incorporate it into your life. And as you gradually grow around your grief, it remains the same size and intensity. And the model in this way relieves you of thinking that your grief should go away or that you'll get over it or move on in some way. And some of these statements might sound familiar to you, actually. So the fried egg model helps you to integrate the loss of the person into your life, and it validates your intense feelings rather than just minimising them which is what happens if you try and get closure or move on in some way. So if we briefly summarise the fried egg model, the first circle represents a life that's totally consumed by grief. The second circle represents people accepting that their grief will never entirely disappear, but over time it will become a more manageable part of their life. And the third circle shows that even though your grief is still there, your new life expands around it. You can grow around grief. And sometimes the growing around grief model is represented by different images. So if you have a look at figure 3, there's an image called the jar. And the jar represents the same process as the fried egg model. You might grow around your grief, represented by the increasing size of the jar. The difference is that the jar has a lid. So some people open the lid on occasions only ever so slightly, allowing the grief out a tiny bit at a time. In this way, you can make time for your grief and acknowledge that it's there. Or you might prefer just to decorate the outside of the jar, nurturing yourself by adding to your life and growing around your grief in a more cautious way. And if we look at figure 4, this is called the flower pot model of looking at grief. I've called this representation of the model the flower pot, but it could be called the plant pot or the flower. You might have your own name for it. But here you can see that you could take a proactive approach to growing around your grief by nurturing yourself over time. This encourages you to grow and flourish, whilst you can still acknowledge the all-consuming and powerful grief you carry with you as you live your life. So, if we summarise Lois Tonkin's growing around grief model, it would be to say that some people find the idea of growing a new life comforting. And this model's helpful to some people because it relieves you of the expectation that your grief should eventually go away or get smaller. And it explains your dark days when things feel really difficult in your grief. It validates your intense feelings rather than minimising them. And it enables you to begin to lose that nagging sense of disloyalty to your loved one that can hold you back and keep you stuck in your grief. And it eases the sense of forgetting your loved one, enabling you to take them with you into your new normal, into a different, more manageable way of living your life. And it describes the richness and depth that the experience of grief can give to your life as you grow around it. And it enables you to continue the process of integrating your loss with your life as you move forward into your future. So I hope my presentation's been helpful for you, and I just wish you all the best. Take care of yourselves in your grief and take care of your grief.